Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be continuing with our series, Dumbfounding Definitions, Dizzying Distinctions, and Diabolical Doctrines, a series sorting through some of the jargon of philosophy. In this video, we're going to be doing a contentious one. What is critical race theory? Now, critical race theory, or CRT, is a legal and philosophical viewpoint that is often misunderstood and misrepresented, both from the standpoint of those supporting it, as well as from those opposing it. In this video, we're going to give you a clear definition of this viewpoint, as well as arguments for and against it. This is going to be a contentious and complex topic, so I'd strongly encourage you to watch the whole video before commenting and be specific with your questions or critiques in the comments. It's not to say you shouldn't be critical of what I'm saying or any of the positions we're exploring here. It's just to say be specific and be clear when you're doing so. So, in the simplest form, CRT is an investigation into and a critique of the systems that give rise to the fact that while legal racial equality was obtained for many during the civil rights movement, this has failed to translate into practical equality of opportunities and outcomes for all races. This basic question at the heart of this movement is, why does racial inequality of outcomes persist, even though legal racial equality has been established? For example, why do black people make up 12% of the U.S. population, but 38% of the prison population? Or why is the median wealth of the an average white household $187,000, but the median wealth of a black household is only $14,000? Note that the exact numbers on this are going to vary by source, but the punchline is going to be the same. We'll look at CRT's response to this question through three lenses: as a reaction to liberalism, as a reaction to Rawls, and as a reaction to an expansion of what is considered racist. So, an often misunderstood feature of critical race theory is what it is critiquing. CRT is a critical response to philosophical liberalism at its core, which is often distinct from the views of politicians who claim to be liberal. Check out our video on what is liberalism and are liberals really liberal for more. Many theorists of CRT argue that the reason that gaps in outcomes for different races have not closed is due to two of the four main tenets of liberalism itself: valuing equality over equity, and only providing rights to individuals instead of groups. We'll take a look at each of those critiques. So, one of the central values of liberalism is valuing equality over equity. The difference between equity and equality goes back to Aristotle, where equality means giving everyone the same thing, and equity means giving people commensurate with their need. Check out our video on equity versus equality for more. According to liberalism, everyone should have equal legal rights to freedom, regardless of their race, gender, class, etc. However, the critical race theorist contends that in order to remedy past injustices, the law should be equitable, not equal, and therefore give those that have lacked the access to justice in the past more leeway, and those that have gotten more leeway in the past have more stringent laws. The reason that racial income and wealth gaps continue to exist despite equality before the law is that legal equality merely prevents the law from exacerbating these gaps. It doesn't address the pre-existing gaps in wealth or lead to an equitable distribution of wealth. The second tenet of liberalism that CRT challenges is the idea that the individual is the only thing with moral status. According to the classical liberal, the idea is that the only things we care about are people, individuals. They are the ones that have moral status. That you can't do a wrong or a harm to a group of people, only particular individuals. CRT argues that systems can discriminate, and they can discriminate against groups of people, not necessarily individuals, even if they fail to discriminate against any one specific individual person based on the beliefs of the person that's going through a process. We can see this in policies such as redlining that made it harder for people who lived in particular communities, who were disproportionately black, to get loans to buy homes and build wealth. The individuals were not denied these services due to their race, but instead due to their location, which just happened to correlate directly with race, but did not explicitly mention race. CRT argues that such systems can be racist, even if no individual was personally discriminated against, and even if no one creating the system actively had a racist intent. Now, we can argue till the cows come home about whether or not redlining was actually purposefully racist, or the reasons behind it, or if it was purposefully anti-poor and poverty happened to correlate with wealth or with race. we can go through that regardless, but the case that CRT is making is saying, setting aside all of that, setting aside all of the intentions, that system can be racist even if there isn't one individual that was wronged, because it gave rise to an unequal outcome in reality. The idea that you can discriminate based on location, which is highly correlated with race, and therefore discriminate and do a harm against a group of people, even if no one person was singled out for a racist act. Another way to think of CRT is as a challenge to John Rawls's famous veil of ignorance. Check out our video on the veil of ignorance for more. Rawls argues that we should decide our laws as if we were behind a veil of ignorance, as if we did not know our race or gender or other demographic characteristics. If you didn't know if you would be white or black, what laws would you propose? Generally, one would be expected to advocate for laws that promote equality and do not privilege any particular group excessively, as if you don't know what group you'd be a part of. The challenge that CRT raises to such a conception is that there may be pre-existing systemic injustices that equality under the law may not aggravate, but might fail to address. By stepping behind the veil, you may also be blind to these pre-existing injustices. Let's say, for example, you had a privileged group of people that was trying to put themselves behind the veil of ignorance, but because they lacked the context or information about pre-existing equalities, they said, oh, of course I would be fine if I was in this disadvantaged situation because the law would apply to me equally. CRT makes the case that you may not be aware of pre-existing injustices, such as the lack of wealth that certain communities have failed to accumulate, and therefore the fact that even if the law is applying equally, those communities will be disproportionately harmed because of historic injustices. Now, another way to understand CRT is as a belief in racism beyond specific individual acts against a person based on their race. CRT takes both systemic and historical racism against groups out of power as immoral as well. Redlining, intergenerational transmission of poverty, etc. CRT even goes so far as to advocate for systemic racism against groups in power in the form of policies such as affirmative action to address these issues as, according to CRT, equality is insufficient to resolve historic oppression that has impacts on today. In other words, advocating for type 5 racism to address types 2 and 3. Check out my video on the 7 types of racism for more on this to explain those type numbers and to understand how I'm defining racism here before you jump down into my comments over whether or not affirmative action is racist. Watch that video and then come back here and comment. But if you haven't watched that video, I don't want to see you in my comments on how we're defining racism or what we're talking about with affirmative action here. The point is that CRT is making the case that there are systems that can be racist. There are historical contexts that can be racist. And that we can justify systems that would respond to that by treating people of different races disproportionately in order to rectify that equality alone is insufficient. Now, many people on both the left and the right of the political spectrum have raised objections to the ideas presented in CRT. Here we're going to cover just some of those objections. Some objections pointed to CRT are arguably spurious, or pointed at a straw man of the position. We are going to do our best to offer the most charitable and philosophically rigorous versions of all objections here. The first objection has to do with a moral case for equality. If all people should be treated the same, it is from this viewpoint that all people should be treated the same. It's from this viewpoint that critics of CRT have made the case that CRT has abdicated its commitment to any number of founding documents, ranging from the U.S. Constitution to the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So when you hear, oh, CRT opposes the basic foundations of the U.S. Constitution or the UN Declaration of Human Rights, it's coming from this idea that those documents focus on legal equality, equality before the law on the basis of race. There is a moral case that equality is a good in itself, that treating people the same under the law is the right thing to do. Some proponents of this objection quote MLK, arguing that people should not be treated differently on the basis of the color of their skin in either direction, regardless of their status and power. Because CRT advocates for policies that treat historically marginalized groups better than those in power to address past inequalities, instead of equal to them, it violates these founding principles. That's the objection. Now, the proponent of CRT might argue that equality is the final goal, but that means equality of outcomes, not equality before the law. In order to get an equality of outcomes, there must be policies that rebalance and address those historical inequities. If you paid one person $1,000 a day and another person $1 a day for years, suddenly deciding to pay them each $10 a day isn't going to fix the underlying inequality, because the person with $1,000 a day is going to have accumulated a lot of wealth over that time. And so the problem is that things need to be rebalanced. And so if our goal is still equality, but equality of outcomes, not equality of treatment under the law, then the proponent of CRT would say, we need to focus on changing how we're treating people so we can achieve equality of outcomes, not equality of treatment. The critic of CRT might respond that if the concern is addressing inequality, that this can be done with pro-poor policies that will disproportionately benefit historically marginalized groups without the need to make any policies being explicitly race-based. And I will say some proponents of CRT would also support such an avenue, while others would focus on policies that are necessarily race-based. In the same way that redlining was used to disadvantage Black people without doing so explicitly, policies that benefit groups with low wealth or income will disproportionately benefit those who have been historically excluded from such benefits, while maintaining formal legal equality across racial groups, and not benefiting those in marginalized groups who have actually succeeded despite the odds. This will be likely to gain also be more likely to gain sufficient political support to be enacted than a solely race-based policy, which might benefit celebrities from marginalized groups while leaving out the poor from more demographically privileged ones. In other words, it's hard to get support for a policy that asserts that Beyoncé needs reparations more than a very poor white family in West Virginia. The point here is this position of saying we want to formulate these policies around addressing inequality and addressing poverty, and with the understanding that that is necessarily going to disproportionately benefit people from historically marginalized groups, we are able to say both we can create a non-race-based policy while also addressing some of these systemic inequalities. Some proponents of CRT are on board with this idea and can defeat this objection in this way. Other proponents of CRT want there to be explicitly race-based criteria, which runs us into all sorts of more objections. Let's take a look at some more of them. So, a second objection in this same vein is around the operationalizability of redistributive policies based on race. Beyond the challenge of building political support for something like reparations for slavery, how would it be executed? Would recent African immigrants be excluded? Would people who descended from slaves but passed for white be excluded? Would people need to prove their lineage back to someone that was enslaved, something likely only available to those that are already relatively well off? What would be done if such reparations failed to address inequality? Would that allow reactionaries to say that any programs geared towards helping African American communities in the future would no longer be justified since they had already received reparations? The proponent of CRT might respond by arguing for a more nuanced form of reparations, perhaps something that's race-blind policy, which has disproportionate benefits for historically marginalized communities, such as scholarships for all first-generation college students or subsidized mortgages for low-income families. The more that the policy focuses on something that correlates with race but isn't race itself, the more justifiable to the public and more operational in a practical sense, it seems. However, some proponents of CRT will insist that there is an ethical requirement that we focus on explicitly race. And they might come up with a series of answers to those questions in that objection of saying, these are the specific people that we need to target based on their race, based on their history, based on how they're perceived in society. Though it may be much harder to get broad political support for that, and the ethical support for it becomes weaker and weaker the more of those choices you make. Another objection to CRT focuses on the idea that communities do not have rights as individuals do. From this perspective, systemic discrimination is not problematic, since you can't single out a person who's individually discriminated against. Another way of framing this is in terms of correlations and causations. For example, one might argue that a merit-based system of college admissions is racist because it produces the outcomes of a higher percentage of certain races attending college. However, you might also argue that this is not because the merit-based system is racist, but rather because educational quality is often determined by your parents' level of education. Because parents of certain races are more likely to be college educated, their children are more likely to get a quality education and succeed at merit-based admissions processes. Even Rawls admitted that the family is an inherently unjust institution, though few would argue for resolving such inequalities by breaking up families and having children raised by the state. Simply because such inequalities exist doesn't mean that a system is racist or therefore blameworthy, or that the benefits of that system, whether that's merit-based education or family structure, outweigh the costs of that inequality. If we wanted to resolve inequality, having all children be raised by the state and not by families might be able to address it. But that is something that would have such costs to society, it's unlikely anyone would ever support it. And so there are questions about the trade-offs here of whether we should be supporting these things that might be able to resolve this amount of inequality at a high cost. Now, the advocate of CRT might respond that equal treatment of individuals means that such correlations between poverty achievement outcomes should not exist, even if there are good, non-racist systems that have given rise to them. They might also argue that such inequities can be addressed without abolishing the systems themselves that created them. That this is not necessarily a zero-sum game. We can provide better education in low-income communities without making the education in higher-income communities worse. We are able to provide much education online to any number of people. We're not in the same way, importantly, limited by class sizes in a way that we were when we could only deliver education in brick-and-mortar institutions. We don't need to abolish merit-based admissions to provide additional resources to students whose families may not be able to pay for a private tutor, etc. One final objection to cover here focuses on the question of moral blame or responsibility. And this is an objection that is often seen and often raised against CRT of people saying that this position makes them feel guilty for being white and makes them feel like they're being blamed or being held morally responsible for the choices of their ancestors. Most policies that would benefit the poor or historically marginalized groups are necessarily redistributive. The money is coming from higher income individuals and going to lower income individuals. Due to correlations between wealth and race, it's often coming from white families and going to black families. Some opponents of CRT argue that this is unfair, as wealthy or white families should not be punished for the sins of their forebears. It does not seem like it's someone's fault that they grew up rich, any more than it's someone's fault that they grew up poor. Your ancestors might have owned slaves or exploited workers, but why should you need to pay for their sins? In what philosophical or ethical framework can we hold you morally responsible for things that your parents, grandparents, or great-great-great-grandparents ever did? Now, there's a lot of directions you could go with this. We've been talking about the possibility of redistributive policies and non-race-based policies, so I'm going to go with a response that fits into that, as well as fitting into an argument I make in my book, which we'll talk about in a second. I think a good response to this is to look at the concept in economics called the marginal utility of wealth. The more money you have, the less each dollar matters to you. The point of redistributive policies is not to punish you or your parents for being wealthy, but rather to say that a billionaire won't miss $100 here or there, but someone with nothing could gain a lot of happiness from that $100. This is another point in favor of income-based or wealth-based instead of race-based policies. There doesn't seem to be an ethical justification for taking money from a poor white family and giving it to a rich black family, even if the white family's ancestors were directly responsible for the enslavement of that black family's ancestors, because the harm caused now to the poor family will outweigh the benefits to the rich family, and the individuals that are alive today shouldn't bear moral responsibility for the activities of their forebears. However, a general policy that redistributes some wealth from the rich, who gain less happiness from that wealth, from that extra dollar, to the poor, who will gain more happiness from it, will disproportionately benefit historically marginalized communities, while having a clearer ethical justification, because it's not that you're hurting one person and benefiting another person equally, because the marginal dollar for the billionaire doesn't matter as much as the marginal dollar for the person in abject poverty. It's not to say that I support a redistributive policy based on wealth, simply to say that it seems to be much more ethically and operationally justified than a race-based one, and it might be more effective and more able to get through political systems while potentially addressing the same issue. Now, do you want to learn more about measuring the costs and benefits of policies, the marginal utility of wealth, and how the lives of white people are valued more than others? Check out our new book on the philosophy of economics, Are All Lives Equal?, which explores why economists value life and how philosophy can do it better. In this book, we talk about these exact questions of, is there the same benefit of an extra dollar towards someone that has $1 billion and someone that has $2? And how can we accurately measure the benefits that people receive from individual policies, given that giving $100 to a billionaire and giving $100 to someone that has nothing is going to increase their utility a different amount? How can we understand that? How can we build that into our policy frameworks and our cost-benefit analysis to show that there is more benefit gained by the person with less than the person with more? That's what the book's about. Check it out. You can buy it on Amazon right now. What do you think? Does CRT sufficiently explain continued disparities between outcomes for racial groups? If not, what explanation would you offer? Are there policies that you would propose to reconcile this disparity? Would they be race-based or income or wealth-based? What are ways to ensure that policies that are addressing this disparity are able to maintain political support in the long term? Is a better method for that focusing on the income or wealth-based policies, or is it being explicitly race-based? What has the better ethical justification? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org. Check out the book, Are All Lives Equal? And stay skeptical, everybody.